welcome back to everybody. I'm delighted to introduce you to Dr. Carmel O'Dohrty. She's a senior inspector with the Department of Education and Science in Ireland. And she has had many guises. She trained as or is educated as a primary school teacher, I think, Carmel, you became a principal and then became an inspector. And a few years ago, she was seconded to the Limerick Education Centre, which is the every county, isn't it, Carmel, has an education centre that the remit is around provision of training for teachers. And Carmel initiated or was part of the steering group that set up this Limerick Primary Schools Literacy Initiative. Both Tracy and Tiernan refer to this as one of the initiatives that they were involved in, and it was a collaboration between the Department of Education and Skills, a number of primary schools in Limerick, and Mary I and the Limerick Education Centre. So I just asked Carmel just to talk about it and some of the outcome, why it was set up, how it was set up, and some of the outcomes. So it really ties in very nicely with what Tracy and Tiernan were talking about in the morning time. So without further ado, Carmel, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Angie, and I've shared my slide there with you, so hopefully you can see it, everybody.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk to you about the Limerick Primary Schools Literacy Initiative, and I'm going to talk to you about the initiative from two perspectives. One, from my perspective of being a senior inspector with the Department of Education when this initiative was established, and then through my experience of working, I was seconded to Limerick Education, the provider for professional development of teachers in the local area, and now I'm back again in the department as a senior inspector. So I'm changing hats every few minutes, so you'll hopefully bear with me. So this initiative, we've got to go back in time a little bit to see the historical background for this initiative. And in 2005, 6, 7, 8, Limerick unfortunately was beset by a huge amount of social, physical, economic difficulties, but I suppose most of all criminality. It was a huge issue within the areas, the disadvantaged areas in Limerick City. And Limerick City itself has one of the highest levels of disadvantage in Ireland. So Limerick Regeneration was launched in 2008, and the government committed €3 billion to focus on these areas of social, physical and economic infrastructure in the city. So the schools became a hub for much of the social development, because in many of these areas, the schools are the centre of the community. And in Limerick at that time, there were 16 DEIS schools. The Department of Education, through its local office, was with a dedicated staff. They networked and worked with the schools in a very, I suppose, worked hand in glove with the schools. And the Inspectorate, plus the psychological services, worked with the schools as well. The department established USCILT, which is a network of principals, and Mary Immaculate College and the department facilitated those meetings. So there was very good bedrock of trusting relationships with the schools and with the department and Mary Immaculate, established about 2008, 2009. And Limerick Education Centre came on board at that time as the main provider for professional development. Mary Immaculate College as well, because of its expertise in English language and reading, but also through its experience of leading projects that targeted educational disadvantage. The department was approached by PIDF, the Programme Innovation and Development Fund, and asked to make a bid for grants. So some organisations were approached and were asked to actually put in an application for funding. And our funding application was put in under the social, which education was falling under. So it had to be a multi-agency partnership, and it had to build capacity to strengthen, adapt and reform mainstream practice. So that was our remit. So we worked with people in Mary Immaculate College to actually put our application in, and we asked Limerick Education Centre at that time to become the lead partner, because as an inspectorate we were unable to manage the funds ourselves. That's not our remit. So Limerick Education Centre became the lead agency in the application, supported by Mary Immaculate Department of Education itself. Now the Department of Education committed a huge amount of matched funding for this initiative. We got about 570,000 from Atlantic Philanthropies. That's Chuck Feeney's fund, which came through to Limerick for that regeneration initiative. So the department matched the funding by retaining additional posts in schools. Initially there were 4 teachers, and this increased to 8 teachers over the lifetime of the initiative. Now the initiative started in 2011 and has only just finished. So for most of that period, we've had 8 teachers employed, additional teachers. They're called ex-quota posts, and their whole remit was to lead the change in the schools themselves, in the network of schools. Also, the department retained ex-quota posts that would have been lost because one of the main focus areas for regeneration was to, I suppose, knock down houses, relocate people and rebuild houses. About 1,500 houses have been knocked down, but unfortunately only about 400 have been rebuilt. So there has been a loss of people in these communities, and as therefore a loss of posts in many of the schools. So the department gave a commitment to retaining the posts so that schools would have the necessary skilled people in the schools to target many of the issues in the schools, such as chronic absenteeism, very low literacy and numeracy, and also disaffection, lack of motivation and behavioural issues. The department also agreed to build a new school campus, Lekela, which is in the south of the city, and it supported amalgamations of schools during the initiative. So at the start there were 16 schools, and at the end of the initiative there were 12 schools. So it strengthened and consolidated staffing through amalgamating schools, but that was a difficulty for some of the schools themselves. So the department also committed an assistant principal officer here in the department and a quarter of me to support the initiative. And Mary Immaculate College committed as well representatives on the steering committee, so to guide the project, and also made available personnel for professional development and particularly in literacy and oral language development. So the aims of the initiative, they were to deepen teacher understanding in relation to what we meant by a balanced literacy instruction. At the start of this initiative, most of the children in the disadvantaged schools would have had chronic levels of literacy, really poor levels of literacy, with 60 to 80% of children being at high risk of school dropout and also complete disaffection from school because they were not able to engage with school because their literacy levels were so poor. We also wanted to share, extend and support existing good practice among schools because we knew some schools had very good literacy practices, and we wanted to support teachers and principals in the management of change in their schools, and we wanted to support whole school approaches to literacy and oral language. And there were good practices in some schools, but it was just to make sure that these practices were shared among the other schools as well, and that we'd also have evidence-based approach. We also had to outline our legacy outcomes for the project. So in other words, what did we want to leave behind? What did we want the schools to have at the end of the project? So we wanted capacity building. We wanted the teachers and the schools to know what was best practice, to be able to access the research that would guide their practice. We wanted to develop literacy teams in schools and develop whole school approaches. And we wanted to strengthen that culture of sharing best practice across the schools themselves. We also wanted the schools to be self-sustaining, in other words, to develop the resources themselves that would enable them to lead change themselves and also to serve their communities in disadvantaged areas. And we wanted to increase parental and community engagement in literacy and improved, obviously, at the end of the day, literacy outcomes for children across the DEIS primary schools. So there were different phases of the initiative. The initiative really was funded between 2012 and 2014, and it should have ended in 2014. But because of the success of the initiative and because of the commitment of the teachers and the principals, the initiative kept going outside of the actual framework of time that was allocated. So for the first phase, we set out the aims. We decided to build up teacher knowledge, understanding and skill. We had a network of teachers, initially 4 and then 8, and these teachers were shared between schools. So they would work between 2 schools and they would share practices and support innovation in schools. During that phase as well, we held a range of open days where schools actually put and organised literacy lessons. And these included station teaching, differentiated reading approaches, small group literacy instruction, and teachers from other schools came, watched, reflected, pondered and identified the areas that they would like to include in their schools. We also explored with the schools, with the help of Mary Immaculate, what a balanced literacy framework would look like. And schools did a needs analysis of their own schools, outlining the types of practices that were in place in their schools at that stage and what they wanted to change. So the main phase of the project was we provided professional development. We also provide professional development and how to use data and how to manage data. Schools were swamped with data and information from assessment, but they weren't using this data. So we actually empowered schools to use the data and look at the data themselves. We focused on oral language because this was one of the main areas of deficit among the children. And obviously our focus for the first phase was on literacy. From 2014 then to 2016, we called it our embedding and sustainability phase. The project as such was over, but we had 90,000 left over. And we decided we would continue with embedding and sustaining the project by running some professional development, but by also having the network teachers there continue the good practice in schools. And then in 2016, we decided, and the schools, I suppose, recognised this, that the gap between them and other schools was widening because of the new emphasis on STEM and numeracy. So for 4 years, we focused on numeracy, and this was without funding itself from that residue of funding that was left over from the literacy initiative, again supported by Mary Immaculate College and led through Limerick Education Centre. So I'm going to take you through phase 1 of the project. We're going back quite a few years and you can see that the focus there was on professional development. So much of our grant aid was spent on providing substitute cover for teachers while they attended professional development. So the teachers were released from schools, they attended the education centre, they received professional development, and a substitute teacher was put in their class. So a lot of money was put into providing substitute cover. In Ireland, if you have a class, you have to have somebody teaching the class while you're getting professional development. So during that professional development, we focus on oral language, how to assess pupils' reading and oral language skills, how to undertake small group literacy instruction, which would be differentiated for different groups, how to engage in speech and language development, because many of the children in these areas have significant speech and language delays. And there was another initiative called Start Right, also funded by Atlantic Philanthropies. So we worked with that group as well to focus on oral language in schools. So schools developed oral language school plans, and we also did the data analysis and training. And we provided CPD for principals on, first of all, the balanced literacy framework, but also they completed a module of the Masters in Education, Leadership and Management in Mary Immaculate as well, focusing on school self-evaluation. Also, we had that network of 4 to 8 teachers, which was 4 initially and then expanded to 8. So the teachers would meet weekly and they were led by a project coordinator, and her salary was also paid from the grant. And the network teachers then worked in their 2 schools, outlining a plan of work that suited the needs of each individual school. As well as that, the department, through the assistant principal officer and the inspector, met with the schools twice annually with the principals to highlight what areas they wanted to focus on, what areas they would like professional development in, what areas were working well, what successes they were having, and what challenges remained. So the network teachers were key to the whole initiative because they provided the agency within the schools, and they also got a core group of teachers with them to lead the change, to ensure that the good practices were being shared. So really the network teachers had to carve out their own role. Their role, they were allowed with plenty of framework to carve out their particular role within school, but we wanted them to add value to the practices there, not just to be a teacher to help out with station teaching or to take a group of children. So you can see here on the graph that This intensive phase was between 2012 and 2014, and we focused on professional development. We also focused on reflective practice, getting the network teachers to reflect on what was happening in the schools, assisting the teachers who observed during the open days to reflect on their own practice and the practice they observed. And also we had discussion following of CPD, and during CPD events teachers were given research articles to read and discuss back at school. And you can see that they were supported in their knowledge in data analysis, oral language, reading, writing, small group literacy instruction, speech and language development. So it was a partnership approach from the very, very start. Obviously, we had the department, Mary Immaculate, and Limerick Education Centre, who I suppose were at the macro partnership. But the real partnership happened when the schools agreed to participate in the initiative. And that really focused on the leadership from the principals, but also from the teachers in the schools themselves. And we asked the schools to devise two teams, one team at the junior end of the school and one team at the senior end of the school, because really this depended on the ability of all to collaborate to ensure this was a success. So working in 2012 and 2013, each school was asked to nominate a literacy coordinator and to identify people at the junior classes and the senior classes who would attend CPD, and that would really have a cascade effect with the teachers back in their schools who would relay the messages. And you can see in the middle HSCL, that's the homeschool community liaison teacher, and that's the teacher that networks with all of the parents. And that was a vital part of the work, because obviously the work of the school had to be supported by the work of the home. So a lot of work was put into supporting parents to read to their children, to acknowledge the importance of reading, and many of the HSCL teachers modelled reading lessons for parents, modelled how to read a book with the parents, so that the parents were involved in this initiative as well. So you can see the people involved were the principal, the literacy coordinator for every school, the shared literacy teacher who was the extra teacher, the network teacher, you have the infant teachers, and then you have the middle and senior teachers. So obviously we had a multifaceted approach, supporting CPD, sharing practice, supporting literacy at each class level, contributing to strong leadership, and then creating a repository of literacy related resources. We focused our work on the theory of learning, Joyce and Shower's work, initially 1982, I think, the year I started teaching, which is many, many decades ago, and revised in 1993. And Joyce and Shower's reflect on the importance of CPD and which CPD type has the most impact. And in Ireland, for many, many years, we've had about 20 years of theory knowledge, where providers would provide the theory and teachers would go away. But we see the actual transfer to the classroom is less than 5% in those instances. But where the most impact happens is when the theory, modelling, practice and feedback and coaching happens. There's about a 75% to 90% impact in the classrooms. And that's the model we hoped to gain from through that multi-targeted approach, through the network teachers, through sharing practice, visits to schools, working with the principals, bolstering leadership, creating understanding, and also applying that to practice. So it very much was a model of theory into practice, led by teachers themselves. At the same time, national policy developments were ongoing, and in 2011, a literacy and numeracy strategy was published by the department, which emphasised these two core areas and required schools to increase the time for teaching literacy and numeracy. Then in 2012, school self-evaluation was introduced. Now, this has been in place in many European countries for decades, but we are new to the school self-evaluation, but it just happened at the right time. Now, all DEIS schools had been required to develop a 3-year plan anyway, but this definitely gave more emphasis to the school self-evaluation focus. So the DEIS action planning that each of the DEIS schools has to undertake had to focus on literacy, numeracy, attendance, retention, progression, and we asked the schools to focus on literacy as a major priority. As well as that, the department introduced what is known as a Croke Park hour, and that's an hour for schools to plan. It's a mandatory hour, and there's only one of these per week in schools. So teachers teach normally between 9 and 2:30 or 2:45, and this is one additional hour that's required for whole school planning. Also at the same time, the department introduced shorter models of inspection, more frequent inspections, and the Teaching Council, which is the formal group for the teachers' registration, was introduced, and this was a very positive development because it placed a greater emphasis on teachers as professionals and also teachers as reflective professionals. Also, revisions to the curriculum happened at this phase, and there were plans to introduce a new language curriculum. So at national policy level, developments were supporting the literacy initiative at local level. Other recent policy developments were the introduction of a new special educational model, which increased the amount of supports available in most schools. So many schools like Tiernan School may have 15 class teachers, but they may have 18 special education teachers to support children's learning. The same with Tracy School, she may have 5 class teachers, but she may have 10 special ed teachers. So team teaching then became a concept underpinning this new model, and this supported the work that we had been doing in station teaching as well. So time for planning was incorporated into that new model, and then our national in-service provider, PDST, the Professional Development Support for Teachers, they introduced team teaching, which again reinforced the work that we had been doing in literacy. And we felt that the work that we had been, I suppose, really we were the forerunners with, had now become mainstreamed. So a range of in-service was happening for schools as well. So the need for in-service at our level, at local level, was much reduced over the years. So we came to the embedding and sustainability phase. Now at this stage, Regeneration had finished formally with the project, but we continued with the project through the network teachers. So we decided there were some schools who were much further advanced than others, and during our twice annual meetings, we knew this from the principals, because they would fill out a review and needs analysis, the challenges that remained and successes they had. So we knew that there were still schools still struggling to embed school-wide structures, because we know that change takes many, many years to happen. So we continued to, with a period of embedding and sustainability, and using the network teachers to support schools to develop. And we continued our cross-school visits and our on-site observation. But we also started visiting schools that were not DEIS schools, that had focused on other aspects of their practice. For instance, cognitive acceleration in maths education. And we saw STEM, we went to open days on STEM in some schools, and we saw that some schools actually had moved and developed, and we felt this was an area for us to move into as well, and hence our numeracy phase came straight after this. So just during that period, the network teachers had freedom to do presentations to their staffs, to do classroom visits, to co-plan, to have study groups, to do demonstration lessons, to have peer coaching, co-teaching, and also to resource manage. A lot of the teachers themselves were reluctant to do demonstration lessons, but they certainly did peer teaching and a lot of co-planning. And through a reflection on teaching, a lot of change had occurred during that period. So additional change factors at local level to bear in mind was, in more than half the schools by 2016, there was a change of leadership in more than half of them. I would say even today, of all the DEIS schools, we're probably have maybe 4 or 5 principals out of those left. So it's probably more than half at the moment. The amalgamations had happened at this phase, and they were quite, I suppose, difficult for the schools themselves. Some schools had relocated. 2 schools, South Hill and the Gael Skull, had moved to a new location. There was a change of network teachers annually because teachers saw it as a difficult job and as a challenging job. So there was a change annually for the network group, and that was a bit of a difficulty for the group themselves to keep momentum going. The allocation of the department's inspector, that was discontinued as well, as the department focused on more inspection work than supportive and advisory work. And the consortium with Mary I, there were lots of changes in personnel there as well, through sabbaticals, retirements, and awaiting nominations for people to enter into the numeracy phase. So at that stage in 2016, we had about 70,000 left, and we continued then into a numeracy phase. So the role of the network teachers was key to this phase and has continued phase up to 2020. And I've spoken about that, so I'm going to go on to the next one. So the engagement with schools and principals, we met with the schools twice a year to record their achievements and to highlight areas for development. And the meetings also provided lots of opportunities for the principals to meet and talk about the aims and direction of the project, but also about issues in their schools that they felt were very pertinent. So there was a lot of sharing of practice there. The network teachers met weekly, and when I was in Limerick Education Centre, I met with them very, very frequently to review what they were doing and to review their practice. And the developments across the schools were discussed, and we also trained up teachers to do literacy liftoff, which is an innovation based on a reading recovery model as well. So the final phase then started in 2016. As well as supporting literacy, we moved to numeracy, and we focused on some of the same areas, supporting small group maths instruction, which was differentiated to support children with the greatest needs and those who were high flyers as well. We purchased a range of resources to support hands-on concrete learning, and maths recovery, which is similar to reading recovery, which is an evidence-based program coming from Canada. Teachers were trained up on that, and pupils were targeted and progress was tracked. Common maths language was being used throughout the schools. Network teachers particularly looked at how to gather baseline data, which is more difficult in maths than in English. We also focused on problem solving, and we had input from Mary Immaculate on problem solving and how to promote that, and how to progress assessment in maths. And we also had study visits to Northern Ireland and Europe, because the teachers themselves applied for Erasmus funding at this stage, and they actually engaged in a whole pile of peer learning and went to professional development in STEM and numeracy across Europe. We also introduced VEX robotics, coding, science, and we purchased materials. And we worked towards, we have a problem-solving publication which is due to be released later this year. And actually we dispersed whatever funding was left to the schools in June. So any funding that was left, I think there was 25,000 left. All of the schools received a grant of 1,800 approximately, and to buy materials or to focus on areas they felt were the most important. The first of our publications is just there, promoting communities of effective practice. And I think Angie has circulated that to you, which is the summary report. There's also a report of PIDF on www.limerick.ie, which was commissioned by Limerick City Council, and Dr. Eileen Humphreys wrote that. And we're awaiting our problem solving in DEIS primary schools, which will outline our approach to problem solving and how to promote problem solving within the schools, and that hopefully will be published before Christmas. So Angie, that's a whistle-stop tour of the DEIS Literacy and Numeracy Initiative there for you.